Hey guys, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I'm here with Dr. Josh Rasmussen. We're discussing his conversation. It was an informal conversation. It wasn't a debate. It was a dialogue between Dr. Josh Rasmussen and Tom Jump, who is, if you're watching this, you're probably familiar with who he is and what he's doing right now. He's having all these debates with Christians, and it's really, I don't want to say it's all about promoting his book, but he says that himself, that he's doing this because he's written this book on God and epistemology, and he basically wants to get it published, and I hope he does get it published. I think he actually sent us a pre-copy. And Josh, you read it, right? Before
Yes, I
even had
read bits of his draft, and I thought it was actually really cool. He's got a lot of interesting things in there, especially toward the end. He's got this moral theory that I was feeling like, oh, there's some valuable points in here that would be good for people to see. So
Yeah, and what was also cool is that, like, I think it was in the book at the beginning. He was saying, like, he reached out to a few philosophers, and even he reached out to Richard Swinburne and, like, wanted to get some feedback on some of the things that he was saying. And so I think that's really cool. I think that it's good when ideas like this can be put forward and teased out, and then we can have these sorts of dialogues where we're talking about whether or not they should, I don't know, move us to believe something that we don't already believe. Or anyways, I think that you see, Josh, that you see the value in this. Well, tell me why, like, why were you interested? You know, because you're a professional philosopher. Tom Jump, like, his ideas are great, but I don't know that he has any, like, credentials behind his name. So tell me why you wanted to have a conversation with him, because some philosophers would be like, well, no, you know, I'd rather just have a conversation with someone who's, like, in the field and is familiar with what's going on in the field and in academia and stuff. So why did you want to
sure.
engage in discussion with Tom?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like at one level, I just find these conversations so interesting, and I feel like I'm always learning more things. I'm always seeing more angles. And I think part of what makes it interesting, and I was sharing this with you earlier, is that oftentimes there are these tensions that happen in conversations, and these tensions happen on different levels. So there's sort of a tension of worldview. So I'm like thinking through ideas, but there's also a tension in psychology. And one thing that I've noticed in this sort of atheist-theist debate is that there's a kind of culture war. And it's happening not just at the level of ideas, but it's also happening at the level of psychology. And I feel like one of the problems I see, Cameron, is that there's a lot of, like, accusation against people. So it's not just like you're missing some truth. It's like you're behaving badly. Like if you're a theist, maybe the idea is that you're not a truth seeker. Your beliefs aren't really based on evidence. Maybe you're just psychologically motivated. And then I see it on the other side. In fact, I've had occasions where I've posted arguments critiquing theistic arguments or arguing for atheism just to sort of experiment and explore. And then I would get accused by people, judged for not, having good motives or really being reasonable, and by people who would otherwise agree with me, right? And I just see this played out, these sort of battles. And one of the things I really wanted to do, and I definitely know that I could have done better at this, but something that I'm striving to learn how to do and just get better at, is to promote a productive, peaceful exchange of ideas where we're just learning from each other, where the value of each other's projects are displayed. And we're not just working so hard to dismantle each other as people, but we're actually working to see what's good in each other's ideas and trying to learn from each other.
One of the problems you face in trying to do that is that it's not as entertaining as it is to see two Spartans sparring, trying to go at each other's necks.
Yes. Yeah, I have to tell you, after that conversation, it was so interesting. The conversation was so interesting to me. I had to give myself a rule to, like, stop thinking about it, because I kept replaying parts of it, and I replayed it in two ways. So in one way, I thought, well, things could have been more rhetorically powerful this way. And then another script was, I could have done better at displaying the value of Tom's project and listening if I would have done this, right? And there was even a tension in my own mind between these two interests. And so that's part of what makes it difficult, right? And that's also part of why people are interested in these things, right? Because there is that tension.
Yeah. So tell me about like the difference in culture war that you see on the popular level versus like, is there even a culture war at the academic level? Like, because you were telling me before we started that pretty much every atheist philosopher, like every professional atheist philosopher, agrees that there's at least some evidence for God.
Yeah, I'm not aware of professional philosophers who don't recognize evidence for the existence of God, at least those who work in the area of the philosophy of religion, who work on the arguments. Michael
And you're like,
Tooley.
yeah, I was gonna say you're like personally familiar with these people, right? Like
Well,
you
yeah,
know them.
friends, I mean, who've emailed me and just told me that, the fine tuning argument pulls on me. Michael Tooley is one who's publicly expressed that there's evidence. I went to a talk by Michael Humer, and he defended the fine tuning argument as evidence for God. And that was a really interesting talk because he gave what he thought were the 5 most common objections to the fine tuning argument, and then he responded to them. And I think people in the audience sort of expected him at the end to say, but in the end, the argument doesn't work because of this, because, he's an atheist, right? But he's just being intellectually honest. And he says, oh, there's some weight here. The next week he gave a talk on the argument from evil. And so he gave argument and evidence on the other side, right? So philosophers are weighing the evidence. Brad Monton in his book, he's got a book on intelligence.
Tell me who these people are, because you're naming these people like everybody knows them or
Yeah,
like best friends with them. Michael Tooley is I actually really I have a lot of respect for him. I've read the book, The Exchange that he had with Alvin Plantinga. I think it's called Knowledge of God. Have you read that book?
yes.
Yeah, it was a really interesting book. And I think Plantinga even said that like we are indebted to Tooley because of how rigorous he like laid out this argument from evil. Like it's one of the most rigorous pieces of atheology that you can get your hands on. And so I don't know. I just have a lot of respect for
Yeah,
him.
I really like Michael Tooley.
Where is he based out of?
So he's at the University of Colorado at Boulder. I actually took a class with him, a seminar in epistemology, and I resonate deeply with his approach. In fact, just last month, I was at a conference. He and I were plenary speakers on an argument for God. And it was a very friendly conversation, a friendly exchange. And he had a list of notes interacting with one of my arguments. And I feel like, he's like one of my favorite type of philosophers because he's just so sincere in his truth seeking. And I feel like we can have a productive conversation. And he's also very well known in the field, very highly respected.
So you're one of you were telling me this too. I hope this isn't too revealing, but you have a real big heart for atheists, right? You want to reach them at a level that probably I don't think anybody is doing right now, because I think that there is this tension where it's like you just want to get into the boxing ring and basically beat up the other person with how reasonable you are and all these arguments and all these evidences. But that's not always what's going to win someone over to Christ. And so tell me where your thoughts are in how you engage or how you think about engaging with atheists.
So first and foremost, I don't even think of atheists as atheists. I just think of them as people like myself. We're all on a journey to understand things. We all have things to learn. I have blind spots. I'm always learning from others. And so I feel like that's the first thing, is like to not even think of people under a category. And yeah, in my own journey, I went through a time where my worldview just fell apart. And it's not like as my worldview got put back together, I came back to like my original box that I was raised in, right? Like instead I discovered this greater world, this bigger reality. And the more that I seek truth, one of the things that I decided during my time of doubt and uncertainty was I felt this conflict between seeking truth and seeking comfort. And I just remember this moment of decision, like I'm just going to follow truth. I don't care where it leads me. In fact, I even remember thinking that Christians who would sort of save their faith by seeking comfort instead of truth, like they're probably not as close to God as atheists who don't come to God, but they're really seeking truth. And I remember like thinking that and feeling that. It's just kind of like just tells you where my heart is, and that just I feel like I get it. Like I understand the desire to seek an understanding of the world that's not just prepackaged. Like you're really trying to find the truth. And so when I'm in conversations with people, I want to have that conversation one that's going to really serve the other person, and not in a way where like I'm the one with all the insights, but like we're both learning, right? Because I think that's a problem that often happens is there's already this background of accusation. And I have to remember that and not take it personally when somebody accuses me. I was in this conversation on Facebook like a few weeks ago. It was a very interesting conversation because I said a few things and then somebody said a few things that were not just disagreeing with my worldview, but were kind of disagreeing with me. And there was a kind of judgment against me. And then I thought about it. And my next comment, I said something in my next comment such that their comment after that was to apologize and then to say something affirming. And you might wonder, okay, well, what did I say next, right? Did I come up with a smarter argument? Did I dismantle their previous comment? Why did they apologize? Instead, what I did was I acknowledged them as being valuable. And I said something like, I like you, I appreciate what you're up to, and I think you're deeply reasonable. And I meant it. It wasn't just flattery. Like I meant it from my heart. And I feel like wisdom flows through love. And I feel like what I see is that there is wisdom. Everybody has insights. Everybody has their own life experiences, and their insights get locked up by these sort of tribal currents, these tribal warfare. And I feel like we work so hard. This is something that this is one of the problems that I face, is something that I've done wrong, is I work so hard to come up with like a clearer argument or better evidence or something. And it's like, but actually that's not really the deep problem. The deep problem is that people don't feel understood. They don't feel heard. They don't feel valued. And I feel like if we can work harder at that and helping people feel understood, valued, and appreciated, it won't be so difficult for the ideas we think we have to be released, or even for us to find out that we were wrong about something.
One last thing before we get into the actual like content of the discussion.
Yeah.
I have a theory about why people like debate online all the time. And it's because I think it really comes from deeply rooted insecurities about like, you want to appear a certain way. I know that this is true for me. Like I want to appear rational. I want to appear like I have a well-evidenced worldview. You know, I don't want to come across as stupid and unreasonable. And so part of the reason why we do that, and we want to like tear down when someone gives us an argument, we want to like tear it down immediately, or we want to give all these arguments in favor of our position, is because of these insecurities. So it's not just like this tribal thing, but it's also like a personal. Do you resonate with that?
Yes, very much. Yes, I don't know if you know Brene Brown. She gave a TED talk about the need that everybody has. Every human being has this need to feel valued. And sometimes we think in terms of the value of loving others, but we don't think about the need that love meets. And we all feel this. And one of the ways in which people feel insecure is when they feel blamed, accused, and judged. And then that leads to the desire to do just what you're saying, is come up with better arguments or destroy arguments. And of course there's value. We have to like look at the arguments, like let's do that, like let's hash it out, let's do that. But I feel like a lot of the progress that people make gets blocked because of this more personal issue that we all experience. I think we can all relate to it.
All right, so let's turn to the actual exchange between you and Tom. And so with all of this in mind of like what's going on behind the scenes, behind Josh's mind, and how to engage an atheist or another person who just disagrees with you, what was your strategy going into this exchange?
So my thought was, first, I wanted to just kind of work with Tom's principles and sort of seek an understanding of what kind of work with his tools rather than try to argue against them, but sort of see what we could do with his tools. So I started by making a clarification about sort of the nature of the debate. So it's not a debate over the existence of God. It's the debate over evidence. And as we've already talked about, atheist philosophers would generally recognize evidence for God. In fact, I even had a conversation on your podcast, Cameron, with an atheist who recognized that there's evidence for God. So it's sort of an in-house debate between atheists, right? So I wanted to sort of clarify that. And then I wanted to talk about what is evidence and make some distinctions and then move from there. And so that was my strategy. Yeah.
Okay. I want to pick up on that thing, how this is an in-house debate for atheists. I think that's really important to understand, because I won't say every, but most theists, most apologists will accept that there's evidence for God. Right. And so what I think what you're pointing out here is that like a lot of atheists agree that there is evidence for God if they don't think that it's like completely convincing. But then other atheists say that there's no evidence for God. And so that's why you're saying this is kind of an in-house debate for atheists. I just wanted to pick up on that because I think that's really interesting.
Yes, and there's a consensus among the experts, those who work on the arguments, that there's evidence for God. And, and it's not like the atheists who recognize evidence, all of them just stay atheists, right? I mean, there are famous examples, like Antony Flew is a famous example of an atheist philosopher. I remember reading his work. In his early career, he argued that the very word God is not even meaningless. So the proposition that God exists doesn't even rise to the status of falsehood. It's not even meaningful, right? But then later he was moved by evidence to think that God exists, right?
Ed Feser is another great example of an atheist who looked at the evidence. Well, really, he's more of a Thomist, so he comes at it from like Thomas Aquinas's 5 ways and everything, which I think he's gone way beyond that. But that's just another example of another atheist who found evidence for God and found it so convincing that he became a Christian.
Yeah, well, it is interesting when you have independent people from diverse contexts coming to sort of a common position that at least that there's evidence for God. A book that I read after our conversation was called The Wisdom of Crowds by James Surowiecki. I'm not sure how to pronounce that, but it was a very interesting book because he talks about how crowds are very smart. In fact, they tend to be smarter than experts. If you've watched that show, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and when they ask the crowd for help, right, because they're trying to get an answer to the question, it turns out that the crowd, the group, gets the answer right more often than the experts. And this is because you have diverse people, when you average the answer. And so this is very interesting because the crowds, if you look at human beings, I was looking up stats, most people believe in God. I mean, I think only like 2 to 5% to 8% would be atheists, depending on the stat or the poll across the world. And then among the experts, it turns out, I was looking up the exact number again, so 9 out of 47 philosophers who work in the area of arguments for and against the existence of God would lean towards atheism. So both the experts and the non-experts, there's a broad consensus that theism is not just that there's evidence for God, but that theism is actually true. And I think that fact itself is a kind of evidence.
Some atheists will pick up there and say, well, wait a minute, because if you look at like all the philosophers, I think it's something on the order of like 70% of them are atheists.
Yes, and also you could maybe analyze sort of the reasons why. Like maybe if you go into the philosophy that studies the arguments, you're more likely to already believe in God. Although there was another more specific survey about people who changed their mind either towards God or away from God after going into the field. And there the data it showed that there's a kind of mix. So people are being moved in different directions. But yeah, I mean, so there are psychological explanations. And so I don't want to press this as like this grand argument, but it is interesting. It's data relevant to the question of whether there is evidence, especially if the experts who don't believe in God would tend to think that there is evidence for God.
One of the objections that I saw from people online, like Facebook, when we like right after the exchange were saying, well, this was like a fun discussion. I don't know what you guys really talked about in the end, but it seemed like we just veered way off course, like really quickly, and then just like never got back to the topic.
Yes, I feel like I want to apologize for that in some way. I mean, I was just having fun with Tom. Like I was like exploring his system, and I wanted to see how his system could sort of uncover some evidence for God. And so I did move away from sort of the original question, like what are the arguments for and against the existence of evidence, right? So
I'll just talk to the audience real quick. What you saw from Josh is, I think and I was actually talking with another philosopher about this. What you saw from Josh is kind of what happens between philosophers when they go to conferences and they're like talking about papers or whatever, trying to convince someone about their argument or their paper or whatever they're defending. A lot of times they'll go into a conversation and try to like start at the base level of like what you already believe and then work up from there. And we are not really accustomed to that. We just kind of like go at it like with swords. So with Josh, he wants to like break away everything else, all this other stuff that just sort of gets in the way. And he's starting with like the basic core beliefs that Tom already had, and then tried to build up from there instead of like, accept this. He wanted to start where Tom was.
Yes. I mean, there were a lot of things Tom said that I could have said, well, why do you think that? But I wasn't saying that so much. I was saying, okay, well, what do you think about this? Because I was trying to build from his system. That was my goal.
Yeah. So I want to talk about one of the first things you pointed out early on was you said that on his definition of atheism, people who actually believe in God could technically be atheists. I thought that was really interesting to point out.
Yes. Yeah. So again, to just realize that this isn't a debate over God's existence, although it sort of feels that way because it's kind of at the heart of this culture war. It's like, oh, well, a theist doesn't have any evidence, so this shows that it's sort of a battle between theists and atheists rather than a battle over the position, evidence versus not evidence. And so I think that's part of what happened there. But yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So from there, you went on to talk about personal evidence. I don't know if you actually use this term, but like personal evidence that you have versus community evidence that anybody could access, basically. So I think the example that you gave was coffee. Like you remembered that you had coffee that morning.
Yes.
So
yeah. So, I have this belief that I had coffee this morning, right? Again, I still have that belief because I had it again, right? It was Starbucks this time.
Did you drink coffee right before this discussion?
No, I did not.
Okay.
Just in the morning. I tried not to do it later in the day. And so I have this memory, right? And there's no peer-reviewed scientific evidence. I don't think that the evidence that I have is going to qualify as evidence on Tom's system. I don't think that it will. And yet, surely I'm justified in believing that I had coffee. Now, maybe he's got a way of accounting for this, but and my goal wasn't to find a problem with the system here. I just wanted to really clarify that many of the things that you personally believe are justified by your own unique experiences, and nobody else has your experiences. And so if somebody says, well, what's your evidence for that? Well, it's a different project to justify your own belief than it is to give somebody else evidence that will justify your belief for them. That's a whole nother thing. And so I think sometimes there's this kind of mistake that people might make in thinking that, oh, well, until I can show other people that I have evidence, I don't even have evidence. I wanted to make that point.
So another really great thing I think that you did early on was you gave an analogy, the game show analogy, right? Like that you had 4 different doors and you were saying that your probability, if you just distribute it evenly, like you don't know something's behind one of these doors. Okay, you have 4 doors, you're on this game show, you're like, if you guess the right door, then you win a prize. I think I'm
yeah. So I had a little bit more complicated in that I had 10% that the prize is in door 1, 20% that it's in door 2, 30% that it's in door 3, 40% that it's in door 4. And I did that because I wanted to make 2 points. So the first point I wanted to make was that when you open up door 1, okay, there's a 10% that the prize is behind there, and you see the prize isn't behind there. Okay, now you've just gained evidence that the prize is actually behind one of the other doors, right?
So tell me, like, probabilistically, how does that work? Okay, so you have like there's a 10% chance, but it was behind the first door, and then do you like split that 10% in 3 and like distribute it to the other doors?
Yeah, well, if you don't have any knowledge, sort of by indifference, you're just going to take that 10%, whatever it was, and you're going to distribute that across the other doors so that each of the other doors now goes up in its percentage
by 3.33%.
It's going to go up by a percentage, and then what I wanted to make clear, and I don't think I did make this clear, is that each of the doors increases in its probability now. Each of them, even though you still don't know which one, is I wanted to illustrate that you can get some evidence. Like getting some evidence is actually pretty easy. Evidence is pretty cheap. You can get some evidence without having sufficient evidence.
This is why it like to bring it back to the atheist-theist discussion. This is why someone like Michael Tooley, who we discussed earlier, would be happy to admit that there's some evidence.
Yes, yeah, because we can rule out some hypotheses. That's like opening the door and saying, "Oh, it wasn't behind that door," and that's going to then increase the probability of each of the other doors, right? And so, I mean, I moved quickly through that with Tom. So I asked Tom about that, and he seemed to express that it wouldn't give you evidence for each of the doors. It would just give you evidence for at least one of the doors. And so then instead of dwelling on that, I just moved on to my next point, which was that if you then opened the second door, then the remaining doors are going to, the door 4, that was 40% probability, that's going to move up higher than 50% probability because we've just removed the 10% and the 20%. That adds to 30%. So that 30% will get distributed in doors 3 and 4. So that door 4 is now above 50%. So now you can even have sufficient evidence for thinking door 4 is the right door, even though you still haven't ruled out door 3. So that was the point I wanted to make there. And it seemed like Tom was happy with that. So as long as so then that helped me to see that for him, if you have evidence that has a hypothesis, more likely than not, that will be good for him. Okay, so that's what I was doing there.
Okay, so let's move to the argument from belief. Is that the way that it goes?
Yeah, so this is sort of interesting. I mean, on one level, you might think a belief indicates evidence. Like, that's too easy, right? You might think that's crazy, right? But
yeah, because I think one of the points that Tom made was that, like, well, that would just, I mean, you think about a crazy person who has a belief, like that doesn't indicate any kind of evidence.
Right, so you can have false beliefs. But so actually there's a standard view in epistemology, and it's called phenomenal conservatism. But the basic idea is that your beliefs can be justified just by reflecting how things seem to you given your experiences.
Well, okay. Don't forget the absent defeaters clause. Yeah, that's really important.
So, well, and you can get evidence, and then that evidence can be defeated, right? And so that's why I used the example of a gold bar, because I wanted to illustrate that desire is not enough. Because sometimes there's this worry that, people who believe in God, it's such a great belief that they must be sort of wishing the belief into their brains, right? Like, it's not based on evidence, it's based on a wish. And I wanted to point out that merely wishing is not going to be enough. Like, I do wish right now in this moment that I had a gold bar in my hand. That would be awesome to, have that. But that's not enough. So what does it take to get a belief? And just to give an example to illustrate this, today, my wife, Rachel, reported to me the belief that she went to the store with the kids, okay? So her evidence for that is her experience of going to the store, but I don't have her experience, so I don't have her evidence. But I do have her belief, and her belief is itself evidence that she has evidence. So
you have her testimony, because you don't have her,
yeah, her testimony reflects the fact that she believes that she went to the store. And so that's how I have evidence that she went to the store, is I have evidence that she has the belief that she went to the store, and her belief that she went to the store is enough for me to think that she went to the store, even though I know that her belief could be mistaken. The idea here is that beliefs they reflect experiences, and experiences themselves give you justification. And I think the thing that you have to realize is that you can have a belief that's based on an experience that's misleading. Mm-hmm. That means you can have a false belief or a crazy belief, but that's not enough to show that the belief, that beliefs aren't generally indications of experience or evidence of some sort. And I think that's how we ordinarily think of beliefs. So we ask people, well, do you believe that? And if they say yes, that indicates something. It's not a proof, but it's something.
Yeah, and I think the distinction between some evidence and sufficient evidence is also important here.
Yes.
Right? Because all you were trying to give is, like, basically what you were doing was you were raising door 1, and you were saying, well, if there's a belief there, then the probability is going to go up. I don't know if that helps. Yes. But you were just saying that, like, yeah, that's going to be some evidence. Yes. That person has evidence.
Yes. And I'm trying to represent atheist philosophers. I mean, the author of, the book that I was thinking specifically is Michael Huemer's book, Skepticism in the Veil of Perception. And he's defended this view that seemings provide justification, right? And so, I'm not trying to represent theists, really. I'm just representing sort of the philosophers and why they would say that there's evidence.
Yeah, and Michael Huemer, he's an agnostic. I don't know if you said that, right? Yes, he's not a Christian, not a theist.
Yes, I think he's an atheist. I think, yeah.
Yeah, I've even seen some of his, like, one of the objections to phenomenal conservatism is that it could be used to justify religious beliefs, mm-hmm. and he even responded to those.
I didn't actually see that, so that's interesting.
Yeah, I didn't find it persuasive. I didn't find his response to that very persuasive, only because I'm so steeped in the literature and religious epistemology that I think his main argument that he used was religious disagreement. I don't want to sure. Yeah, let's not go down that rabbit
Yeah.
trail. All right, so let's talk about Cameron's ears. Cameron's ear hypothesis, which came up and was kind of funny. I don't know if
Yeah. So part of what I wanted to do there was the sense that I got from Tom was that you can't you can't get any evidence or any justification for any metaphysical claim about ultimate reality. That was kind of the sense I got from him. Now, it could be that I'm sort of misunderstanding him, but it seemed like he was saying you couldn't get any good evidence for any claim about ultimate reality. So I wanted to give a counterexample to that.
Yeah, and I think the reason why he says that is because he thinks that metaphysical claims have to be known infallibly. Like you can't be wrong about that belief. And that's what he was talking about, like metaphysical evidence. When I asked him, when I asked for him to like clarify what he meant, that's what he explained it as: infallible. Like this is an infallible mental state. You can't be wrong about this belief. And so that's why he would say that you can't have any kind of justification for these magnificent metaphysical claims like God's existence, because you don't know that infallibly, basically.
Yeah, well, and there might also be more going on. I mean, I also kind of got the sense that there's this sort of problem of empirical equivalence where you have multiple hypotheses that sort of equally account for anything you can observe empirically. And so given that, you can't sort of decide which hypothesis is the right one. And especially if you're thinking of evidence as needing to indicate the winner over the competitors, then he might think that you can't really get evidence for one hypothesis over the others. So I thought maybe that could be part of what he was thinking. I'm not quite sure, but it seemed like he was happy to grant that your ear is not the uncaused cause of reality. So it seemed like he was happy with that.
True. Yeah, he did see, because when you gave the hypothesis that the pixels on the screen are caused by Cameron's ear, he did want to say that that's unreasonable. But the reason why he said that was because we have an empirical basis for other minds.
Yes. So then the next thing that I wanted to do after that was to show that no matter what empirical evidence you cite, your ear hypothesis is still empirically equivalent to other hypotheses. I mean, we can add all the empirical data and we still get empirical equivalence. And that's why then after that, I moved to sort of grand theories of ultimate reality. And I wanted to sort of see if he would agree that some theories, and this is a point that it takes a little bit of work. I mean, there's an epistemology to this here. So it's not sort of easy to just get this fleshed out quickly in a conversation, but I wanted to draw attention to what's called the prior probability of a hypothesis. It's probability prior to the evidence that we're considering, and that you can have different hypotheses that have different prior probabilities. They're not just all equally silly or equally unlikely. Some of them are going to be more likely than others. And the Cameron's ear hypothesis is very unlikely, and we can all agree with that. Your ear probably isn't the uncaused cause of the universe. Even though that's empirically equivalent, we can explain all the data in terms of your ear and its laws and whatever we just add to the hypothesis. We can explain all the data, but that's not very likely. And there are more likely hypotheses that we can think of.
Let me give another example that might help too.
Yeah.
So basically the point that you're making here is that you can have multiple different hypotheses that all explain the data the same. So let's use a really mundane example. So a lot of people like to use court cases. Like if someone is accused of murder, okay, and you have all this evidence, the person's like fingerprints on the gun, there's some like DNA left at the scene, there's eyewitnesses. So you can come up with a bunch of different hypotheses that explain that evidence. But okay, so one of the hypotheses is that, well, John was the killer. Like his fingerprints match the fingerprints on the weapon. It's his DNA at the scene, or there's like a really high chance or low chance that it's not his DNA. And then people saw him, like they identified this guy here. But you could come up with another hypothesis that explains all the same data, like some aliens came down and planted the fingerprints, planted the DNA, and then sucked up those eyewitnesses and implanted stuff in their brains that made them think that they saw John there. Okay, this is an empirically equivalent hypothesis,
Yes.
the alien hypothesis.
Yes.
It explains all the data exactly the same,
Yes.
but no one in a court setting would take that hypothesis seriously. And the reason why they wouldn't take it seriously is because it's way too complex and because the prior probability,
Yes.
that term you used, is so incredibly low.
Yes.
Like, it's just not something that we would take seriously.
Yes. Yeah. And complexity is a tool that we can use to sift between prior probabilities or to estimate which hypothesis is lower in its prior probability. That's why complexity is relevant. I mean, and this is why in this sort of popular debate on the existence of God, you'll often hear people say things like positing supernatural beings beyond the natural world is to increase the complexity beyond necessity. And so we need to use Occam's razor and shave off unnecessary complexity. And I think that's a really good point, right? Because the simpler the theory, the more probable it is prior to the evidence, right? So then, I mean, if you have independent evidence that can overcome the low prior probability, that can happen. But if you have empirically equivalent hypotheses, simplicity is a tool that you can use to sort of figure out which is the best one.
And this came out later on in the debate when we were talking about simplicity. Like, this came to light. It wasn't necessarily put in these terms. It wasn't put in like we have
Well,
these
I wasn't even thinking, Cameron, that it was a debate, but it was a conversation. Right. It sort of felt a little bit like a debate, right? Especially, I felt like maybe as we moved along, there was a little bit of sort of this interest in clarifying things in a way that, yeah, maybe it did feel a little bit like a debate, even though I didn't want it to be a debate, right? But anyway, continue.
Define debate. Yeah. I'm just kidding.
I don't know.
Okay, so let's move on to the next argument that you talked about. The reason why we're going through all these is because I've actually never heard of these, some of these before, and I found them just really fascinating. So I just want to make sure that we go through them so that we can all be on the same page about like what the actual argument is, and then maybe some of his response. But mainly, I'm more interested in like understanding what the argument was.
So let me just tell you kind of the big picture of what I was thinking, right? Okay. So what I was thinking was that Tom's got this nice principle of evidence, a system by which he's trying to figure out the ultimate nature of reality, right? And from what I could tell on his,
he wants. So I think just to jump in here, what I think he wants is to hold true beliefs and only beliefs that he can hold with justification, with an adequate justification.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
Yes. And so it looks to me that what he wants is the best explanation that is supported by the evidence, right? So my sort of big picture thought is that let's come up with a hypothesis where the prior probability of that hypothesis is not very low and it's got a high degree of predictive success. So Tom uses this phrase, future testable prediction. And so I like that. So let's come up with a hypothesis that makes future testable predictions and it successfully makes those predictions. So we actually do the test, we do the experiment, and like, oh, wow, it's correct. So that's what I was doing. So there are two parts to that. So one part was, that's why we were talking about the simplicity of the hypothesis of a supreme foundation or a rational foundation, because that's relevant to the prior probability. And then the second part of that was looking at particular pieces of data, like the existence of principles of reason or the existence of moral principles, or even
so you don't just want a theory that explains the data, right? You want a simple hypothesis.
Yes, the best explanation of the data, right? So I had sort of this high bar now. Now I'm not just looking for bits of evidence. I'm looking for what's the best explanation of the whole thing, right? And so, I mean, as far as I can tell, the simplest account of ultimate reality that has the highest predictive success is going to be something like, the supreme being or a rational foundation. And we can talk more about, why I think that and some of the arguments there. But I want to just, at the big picture, point out the difference between two parts of the conversation. One is about the prior probability, and then the other is about the predictive success, right? And so
so let's talk a little more about prior probability. I think that would help the audience a little. What do you mean by prior probability? What is that?
So in your forensic case, that was a good case, right? Where you have two different hypotheses. There's the alien hypothesis and, another hypothesis, and they're not sort of equal in their probability, even prior to the evidence. And then even when you see the evidence, the one that is more complex is going to be less likely even on the evidence, even though they both predict the same evidence. Yeah, so that's basically the idea.
Okay, so I'm hopeful that people can see the difference there. Like it's the prior probability is like how likely something is before you look at any evidence.
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
So before we had before we actually look at the evidence of the fingerprint on the weapon, the DNA, and the eyewitnesses, how likely is that hypothesis before we look at any of those things,
Yeah,
basically?
and then we just use this same method when we're looking at theories of ultimate reality. So like there's a hypothesis that ultimate reality is designed by a flying spaghetti monster, right? There's that theory. Or the Cameron-Ear hypothesis, or the rational foundation hypothesis. And so we can come up with these different hypotheses, and then we can ask ourselves which one prior to the evidence is going to have the best prior probability, the best probability. So
Okay, and so that's the prior probability. And
yeah,
let's talk about that. Like, let's shove that to the side for a moment, and then talk about the different points of data that you were trying
yeah.
to
So
bring up.
I want to make one more point about the prior probability.
Okay, go ahead.
Because I was sort of reflecting on the conversation with Tom, and I was thinking about, because I had this idea that the flying spaghetti monster, I feel like this is actually kind of an ironic point that people miss, is that the flying spaghetti monster multiplies complexity in precisely the way that I would think that limiting the foundation so that it's not supreme is going to multiply complexity. And here's why I think it multiplies complexity. It's not because limits themselves make the prior probability make it a lower prior probability. So I think that's where Tom and I were talking about limits, and he was saying, well, if it's unlimited, that makes it even worse. It's not about limits versus unlimits. That's not the deep insight here. The deep thing that's going on is that if you specify additional limits, so like let's say that you say the foundation has the power to produce 10 to the 55 plus 16 particles and no more. It takes a complex bit of information to describe that limit. It's the complexity in the description, in the theory, that lowers the prior probability. And you can shave off that complexity by having a simpler theory where you're not specifying all these particular properties as the sort of ultimate explanation, like you would in the flying spaghetti monster case. That's what multiplies complexity, by saying there's a particular kind of monster with vertices and it can fly in a certain way. And these particular vertices and properties add to the complexity of the base theory. And so, I mean, I feel like that is a point that maybe isn't really seen very clearly. And I want to make that clear because it's missed. People miss that. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So I just want to talk about that a little more.
Yes.
Okay, so you're saying that limits aren't the thing that make it complex.
It's not limits per se. It's
That
not
make it
that. It's the
complex.
complexity. It's the description of the limits.
Okay.
Yes. And so, for example, one of the things that gets confused sometimes, I think maybe even in the conversation we were having, there was a kind of tendency to slip into talk of a simple being versus a simple theory. It's not that the simpler being is more likely. It's that the simpler theory is more likely. Now, maybe a simpler theory is going to imply a kind of simplicity at the foundation of the being. Maybe the being has a fundamental aspect that's easy to describe, right? But that's not what helps the prior probability. It's the simplicity of the theory that is doing the work.
The simplicity of the description of the theory, right? So
Yes.
like, okay, so let's go back to the forensic analogy then. Okay, so like I could say John is the murderer, or I could say aliens explain the data. Like how does that? Those look like they're not too different as far.
Yeah.
As
Okay. Good. So you're bringing up a nice point, which is that simplicity isn't the only thing that plays into the prior probability. So it's something, but it's not the only thing. So in the case of aliens, we have maybe independent evidence that these aren't the sorts of things that are explaining data like this, right? And so there are other things that we can then think about in that particular case. So it's basically, you can think of simplicity as helping to break a tie. Other things being equal, you want the simplest theory. So this is why then we move into predictive success.
Okay, I still think that it would be more complex because if you're specifying aliens, you're talking about more than one alien, right? So I think
maybe you could say a simple single alien or something.
Yeah, one alien with all this power to do all these things.
Yes.
Which I think you'd have to specify like what alien you're talking about, right? Would that come into like?
You can maybe just leave it open, like some alien.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, let's move on to the next point.
Okay, so predictive success. So one of the examples is reason permanence. So you are familiar with object permanence. Here's an argument for reason permanence.
Well, let's talk about object permanence because I don't think everybody is. So like, this is my business cards. Might as well show a couple of these off. This is a business card that I had made, and I don't know. Maybe this is a good or bad example. I don't know. So I put this cover on here, and you know that the object is still in there, right? Ta-da! It's still in there. So the object was in there the whole time. That's object permanence. Is that right?
Yes, and it exists even when you're not thinking about it.
Yeah. So I can put it over here.
Yes.
I don't know. I'm still thinking about it, but if I weren't thinking about it, it still would exist.
Yeah. So I have an 8-month-old, and he's learning object permanence. And the other day it was very cute because he was playing with this little plug, and it slipped behind like a box, and he was reaching for it. And I thought that was very interesting. But then he got confused. He didn't know where to look anymore. But he had this sense that thing that he couldn't see anymore was still there, and he was trying to find it, right? So kids start to learn object permanence. It takes some work. It's not sort of automatic. And right, so you can think of object permanence as the kind of best explanation of your pattern of experiences with objects. And in the same way, you can think of reason permanence as the kind of best explanation of your pattern of experiences with principles of reason. For example, what's a principle of reason? Well, think of just any kind of truth that you can sort of see in your mind, like the truth that nothing can be true and false at the same time, or 2 + 2 = 4. And you can just see these truths in your mind. But something else that you can see is that these truths have a kind of, when you think about 2 + 2 = 4, that's different than the proposition that there's a box on my desk in a very specific way. The box on my desk, I have the sense that the box could be off my desk. Whereas when it comes to 2 + 2 = 4, I have the sense that 2 + 2 couldn't fail to equal 4, or it must equal 4. There's a kind of necessity to that, right? And so then I can infer from its necessity that 2 + 2 = 4, even when I'm not thinking about it. There's a kind of reason permanence there.
Yeah, I like another example that Alvin Plantinga gives. He's a famous Christian philosopher. He's awesome. He gives an example of we're talking about like necessary truths. Mathematical truths like 2 + 2 = 4 is normally thought of as like a necessary truth. Here's one that I like to talk about a lot is the number 9 is necessarily composite. It can be divided by 3. And that's like a necessary truth, right? It seems like there's no possible world, there's no possible reality where the number 9 could fail to be composite.
Yes.
And but there's no possible worlds where like this box right here could fail to exist.
Yes. And the number 9 can't be composed of people. So,
right.
It's composed of very specific things, and it can't be composed of certain other things, right? So there are these necessary truths. And so it's interesting because, Tom made a nice point. He said, well, maybe reason is just describing nature. And maybe the reason that reason is permanent is because nature is permanent, right? So that was a nice point, right? Because this can explain the permanence of reason without appealing to what I was calling a rational foundation, right? And so then the only thing I want to add to that is, I think that's right. I actually wanted to celebrate that point of agreement that reason describes nature, but then what part of nature is reason actually describing? Okay, so here's an example to draw this out. Consider the proposition that if there are 2 unicorns climbing a tree, then there's more than one. Okay.
More than one unicorn.
Yeah, more than one unicorn.
Okay.
I'm
thinking about unicorns climbing trees. That's an interesting thought. Okay, go ahead. Okay.
Now, I use this example because it's not really describing anything that really exists. It's not describing unicorns.
Right.
In some ways it is, but not actual unicorns, right? So what's it actually describing? Well, it's describing something, because if it's true by corresponding to something. It's describing something. It's not just describing your own thought, because it's true even when you're not thinking about it. And so many philosophers, they would use this as a reason to think that mathematical principles and principles of reason, principles of logic are actually describing an abstract realm, an abstract aspect of nature. And so the nature of nature includes principles of reason. So there's this principle that, 2 + 2 = 4, and that some numbers are composite, but they're not composed of people, and that if there's 2 unicorns, then there's more than 1 unicorn, and that these principles have a kind of permanence to them, and their very nature is abstract and thought-like. So this is the interesting thing, is that the principle that 2 + 2 = 4 has the same structure as the thought that 2 + 2 = 4. So there's a kind of thought-like structure to it. But it's not the same as my own thought. And so it's something, it's thought-like, it's permanent, it's built into this sort of abstract fabric of reality.
This kind of reminds me, to jump in, this kind of reminds me of our discussion for those of you guys watching. Josh and I did a 4-part series on the argument from contingency. It's on our podcast. If you go to SoundCloud, you can find it really easily. But this reminds me of kind of like stage 1 of the argument from contingency, where basically we conclude that there's some kind of necessary part of reality. So this would seem like if he grants that there's a necessary part of reality, then he's sort of agreeing with stage 1 of the argument from contingency. Does that compute with you?
Yeah. And then in a similar way, if there are these necessary principles of reason, this is kind of part 1 of a larger argument. And in the larger argument, you could put it in terms of predictive success. So I was thinking of it this way. If there's a foundation that's rational, then that would predict that there are principles of reason. And if it's supremely rational, it would have perfect principles of reason. And so this sort of distinguishes our thoughts from logic itself. Logic reflects perfect reasoning, whereas our thoughts don't always reflect perfect reasoning. And it gives you a future testable prediction. So it's not just about the past, right? Like we can test again whether 2 + 2 will continue to equal 4. Just check in your mind. Oh, it does. It still equals 4. Okay, well, this is a future testable prediction. If the foundation is rational, that predicts that there's going to be these rational principles. And again, this isn't to say that there aren't other hypotheses that can predict the same results, right? So this is why when you're looking at theories of the world, you want to look at theories that have the highest predictive success and don't build in ad hoc complexity. And so this is a bit of evidence. That was my goal, is to point to a bit of evidence that's successfully predicted by a rational foundation.
Okay, so do you think that is not predicted on his naturalistic pantheism?
Well, so I mean, I'm not even sure his naturalistic pantheism is inconsistent. So what we need to do is we need to find a hypothesis that competes with the rational foundation hypothesis, right? So I think we could come up with one, right? So we could come up with a hypothesis that the foundation is mindless, there's nonsense, right? There's not rational causes, there's no principles of reason built into the foundation. And
okay, so I think this idea of like competing, it came up a lot during the discussion, and I think we really need to flesh that out real quick. So like the John is the murderer example, going back to the forensic case, this is incompatible, it's inconsistent,
or competing.
It's a competing hypothesis with the alien hypothesis, right?
Unless it could be both. I suppose it could be both.
Okay.
Together. But I think it's built into the alien hypothesis that it was just that alien.
Right.
Yes.
Okay, so that's the idea here, right? We've got to find, well, why is that important? Why do we have to have a competing hypothesis?
Well, so if you don't have a competing hypothesis, then what can happen is the hypotheses could actually be part of the predictive success. So I think about this sometimes in terms of the natural order. So sometimes people think of naturalism as sort of competing with a supreme foundation, but actually a supreme foundation would predict a rational foundation, because a rational foundation is more supreme than non-rational foundation. But then an unrational foundation, I think, makes very probable a natural order to things. Things aren't happening randomly or magically. There's a kind of predictive nature to things. That's what I would expect from a rational foundation. So there's not really a competition, because if somebody says, oh, well, you have an argument for rational foundation, but look, we can explain that through a natural order. Well, but if that's not a competition, then in fact, actually, the natural explanation is additional evidence for the rational foundation, because
That is so important.
It's part of what's predicted by the rational foundation. And I feel like this is also one of these things that gets missed in the popular level conversations. Actually, this one I think gets missed even in the academic conversations. This is one that I feel like has not been really brought to light very clearly. Because I see there's this debate between the naturalists and the supernaturalists. And the idea is that the supernaturalists are positing something sort of beyond the world. And if we can explain everything by the natural causes, then there's no need to posit this extra thing. But I think that way of framing things masks this other insight, this point, which is that if you have a foundation that's rational, that's consistent with a natural order and even predicts a rational order to things that's going to be, you could say, describable in natural terms, depending on what you mean by natural. I mean, I'm never really quite sure what the word natural means, especially if natural can include beings that have reason and intentional powers. Because the idea is that, well, if the world is completely natural, then that means God doesn't exist. But wait a minute. If the world is completely natural and it includes beings with reason and intentional powers, the powers to choose, then why couldn't the foundation of this world be of the same category, just supreme, be perfect, just like the principles of reason themselves?
I think I'm starting to, I'm trying to like put this in like another example, but I actually want to bring it back to the forensic example.
Yes.
So we're still talking about this, like this idea of the theories have to be competing. So John was the original hypothesis. That's like, it's one guy who has the same fingerprints as his DNA. Someone saw him there, but there's another hypothesis, John and Sarah. Okay. And then Sarah, her part in this would be like, maybe she helped plan it. Okay. So the John hypothesis is not in competition with the John and Sarah hypothesis.
Yes, that's a good example. Yes. And then the example that I used last time was, if I drop this pen and you see, oh, this fell, and you say, oh, well, the reason it fell is because I dropped it. And somebody says, no, the reason it fell is because the law of gravity. And it's like, but there's not really a competition there. I mean, it's the law of gravity is at work when I'm dropping it.
Right. Okay. So, yes. Well, I think, so here's, I guess, where that would, I think that he would grant that, Tom would grant that, but what he would say is that the gravity plus the other person dropping it, just like adding Sarah to the John hypothesis, would add complexity.
Yeah, so this is where we talked a little bit about levels of explanation. So the thought is that if I drop this and you say, okay, you're dropping this explains why it fell, that's one level of explanation, right? But there's still a level of explanation at work when we talk about gravity, and there's not really a competition there. And in fact, gravity you might think is sort of a deeper explanation. And this is relevant when we're talking about sort of the deepest ultimate layer of things. We're looking for the deepest explanation of everything else. And if there's not a competition, right, then there's not a problem.
And your idea is that we still need like a rational foundation to explain everything else? Is that the idea? Because without you being there to drop the pin, we wouldn't have an explanation.
Yeah. So, well, at this point in the conversation, I'm just thinking about predictive success and uncovering evidence. So I'm not even making sort of this bold argument that you need to have this. Like there's no other, there's no other possibility. It couldn't be Cameron's ear. It's like, well, maybe it could be Cameron's ear. As far as, I mean, for other reasons, I think that we can rule out Cameron's ear for other arguments. But I mean, as far as the conversation, same with the forensic case, like maybe there's aliens and multiple beings that are possible explanations, and we don't have to rule them out as impossible, right? But just that if they're not competing, explanations, then, well, if they are competing explanations, well, then you can compare their prior probabilities. But if they're not competing explanations, then we have to like still investigate whether they have predictive success. And that's really the point here.
Okay. So we talked about reason permanence.
Yes.
Let's move to the next one, which is the being rationally situated. And I think a lot of people were commenting and saying that like that phrase didn't really cohere with them. They didn't really
I was trying to
understand
think of
that.
a way of putting this. You know, one of the things that is interesting to me is that we can infer conclusions based on seeing many different examples. This is just probabilistic evidence. And so we could see many emeralds are green, therefore probably they're all green. That could be defeated. We could see that, you know, this is sort of an argument people use for naturalism. So many things have sort of natural properties, or every object we see is natural, therefore they're all natural. And so I wanted just to use that same principle. We have lots of examples of things that are parts of minds or parts of products of minds. And now, unless we have independent evidence that something doesn't fit that category of being part of a mind or part of a product of a mind, then we have some evidence that everything is part of a mind or part of a product of a mind. So that was the idea. Of course, people can respond and say, oh, well, there's all sorts of things that aren't parts of minds or parts of products of mind. But then we have to look for the evidence. Okay, what's the independent evidence? And you know, that's not really an easy thing to show, especially if your bar of evidence is so high that it has to be sufficient evidence. Some evidence is not enough. It's got to be sufficient evidence. It has to have predictive success. And I mean, I'll just tell you honestly, Cameron, I don't know of a single thing that I can think of that would not be part of a mind or part of a product of a mind. Can't think of a single example. I don't have good evidence for that.
Yeah. So you talked about like dirt.
Yes.
Right? You still think that dirt is rationally situated or the product of a mind.
Yes. But the thing to realize is that, you know, this. Okay. So I just want to make sure this is clear. If you see a bunch of emeralds and they're all green, and then there are some emeralds in a cave, okay, and you haven't looked at those emeralds, should you think they're green, or should you think they're not green, or should you be agnostic about it? If all the emeralds you've seen are green, then you have evidence that the emeralds in the cave are also green. So I was thinking that if you look at some dirt, unless we beg the question and assume that the dirt is part of a mind or part of a product of a mind, or that it isn't, right? Then the dirt is like the emerald in the cave.
I have an objection.
Yeah, go for it.
My objection is our sample is not representative. So the emeralds, we're talking about these emeralds, okay? Well, actually, let's do this. So we don't know. Well, actually, we have to specify first. So like, how many emeralds have we seen in this example? Let's say we've seen 1,000 emeralds.
Okay.
And they're all green.
Yeah.
Okay. However, when we're talking about this cave of like unknown colored emeralds, if we don't know how many emeralds are in there, like we don't know how representative our sample is, then maybe we should be agnostic about what the rest of the color emeralds are. Here's another example. Suppose that like you're wondering what the demographics are of the entire population of the world, and you're wondering like, is everybody in the world white? Suppose you grew up in a white town and it's like 10,000 people and everybody's white, and you're wondering, well, like, is the entire world white? Is there only white people? You would think that like if that's your whole sample is your town of 10,000 people, you'd think that you'd want to be a little cautious there, a little skeptical about like applying that inference and making that inference more general to the rest of the population.
Yes.
Right. And so maybe our concern is that the sample that we have is not representative of everything.
Well, that's a very, very nice point. I mean, this is why I said it's a bit of evidence that, you know, like any bit of evidence could be defeated by further consideration. Now, from the investigations that I've done, the more we look into the natural world, the more we find things like the fine-tuning of nature itself to allow for biological complexity. We talked a little bit about that at the end. There's also just the fine-tuning of the entire universe. And so I don't see that further investigation is actually leading away from the trend or uncovering evidence that would point in the other direction. But I don't want to overstate that, because one of the things I think that does easily get lost in these conversations is that if all we're trying to figure out is there any evidence? Is there any evidence? Just getting a bit of evidence should not be that difficult. I mean, bits of evidence, right? Like, I mean, you could just see one emerald and see that it's green. And you haven't seen anything else. You don't even know what the sample size is. You still have a bit of evidence that they're all green just from that one, even without even knowing the sample size. It's a bit of evidence. Now, yes, seeing that there's a high sample size could make you sort of, maybe it's not sufficient evidence to give you a belief, right? It's some evidence, but not sufficient evidence. So that, I feel like that point gets lost, and that needs to be clarified. Is that all we're looking for is some evidence? So I think your point about sample size is a good point, because it invites us to consider more evidence. I don't know. Does that seem like that kind of meets your thought, or do you feel like that doesn't?
No, I think it does. Well, I don't know. I don't know that I would grant that. I'm thinking back about like my example of the 10,000 people in your hometown. Like I in that situation, and maybe that's just because I know that the world is made up of, all different types of races. Maybe that's what's coloring my judgment here. But to me, I would want to remain completely agnostic as to like applying that inference to the rest of the population, especially if I don't know how big the population is.
Well, yeah. And again, I mean, it could be that you have a bit of evidence, but it's not enough to move you off of agnosticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So,
I think that, I see your point. So let's talk.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So I think we should also, this is the last thing that I think we should discuss before taking questions, which is because a lot of the discussion centered around this idea of like the predictive success by the simplest hypothesis. And a lot of the discussion talked about simplicity, like what is simplicity? How are we supposed to think about it? So let's talk about that. And that's one of his biggest objections that I heard was that the guide hypothesis is just completely way too complex, right? Omnipotence, omniscience, like these properties are just way too complex. We don't need them.
Yes. I thought maybe we were making some progress there. I mean, even at the very end, it seemed like maybe he was seeing that maybe there's something else here than what usually comes out in these conversations. And I mean, I'm not sure, I can't, really read his mind, but it seemed like one of the things that we needed to get clear on was the difference between the complexity built into the theory and the complexity implied from the theory, right? And so this is one of the things that came out. So if you have a theory about, let's say, the genetic similarities between organisms, then that's going to make specific predictions about my genetic similarity to your genetic similarity. But these specific predictions are not making the original theory more complicated. And sort of in the same way, if the supreme being hypothesis makes these predictions of supreme knowledge, power, and goodness, these predictions don't invade the original hypothesis and make it more complicated. And it seemed like after that, Tom's worry was that nothing is actually predicted. Like nothing follows from the supreme.
Oh yeah, because everything is arbitrary.
Yes. Right. And so then we just have to look at it. I mean, that's a matter of considering the property. Can you see? I mean, in this, you have to do the work. You have to actually consider supreme value. Think of value to its highest degree, and then just think about it. If I like to use the praise test, if I'm praising my wife and I'm saying, "You are so valuable. You have so much knowledge. You have so much power. You are so evil." It feels like that last thing I said is inconsistent with the first two. And I think the reason it feels that way is because I'm seeing that supreme value implies supreme virtue, not being evil, Or if I say, you are so awesome, Rachel, you are so virtuous and so powerful and so ignorant of so many things. Oh, there, the ignorant seem to be out of step with the previous two things. And so
I want to point out two things real quick.
Yes.
So first thing is that he was really skeptical about being able to see objective value.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to point out how, like, I think it's half of ethicists, half professional ethicists are moral realists. And so I think that Jump Tom is going to be, he's going to need to defend that a little bit more, or that's something that I guess all of us need to look into further. It's not something that can just be accepted by default. There's a lot of problems with seeing value as a sort of like subjective feature of reality.
Yes.
There's probably, there's a lot of problems with pretty much every view. So we can't
and I just want to even affirm that. And I just want to say, because this sometimes doesn't get said, is that if somebody doesn't see something that I think can be seen, I'm not going to blame that person. Like, and maybe I think that I see something, you know, and they're right. Right. And so I think that in order to see these inferences, if they are there to be seen, you have to do the work. I mean, it's not just about making an argument and then saying, okay, now you're irrational if you don't agree with this. You have to really do the work of investigating the moral foundations and looking at these inferences. So
I just think it's important to point out that if you believe in objective value, then you can't take Tom's line. Like, you can't go the line of like value is all subjective. And so that was sort of his way out of this argument at this point. I wanted to point that out, but then I also wanted to talk about how you mentioned another way that we could look at it, which is from power.
Yes. So Tom and I agree that there is a sort of foundation to reality, that it has some power. And so then again, I'm sort of looking at, okay, well, let's just think together as friends, as explorers, you know, let's just think about what kind of power it might have. Let's come up with some different hypotheses, right? And so
his hypothesis, I think, to jump back in, was that he wanted to give the hypothesis only as much power as was needed to explain the effect.
Yes, it has precisely the power that would be involved in explaining the kind of universe that we have, right?
Yeah.
And
he thinks that that's like that's the simplest hypothesis, is the one that is most limited.
Yes, right. Then my worry there was that you're building the effect into the hypothesis. So this is why I went back to the camera and ear hypothesis with respect to explaining the pixels we're seeing on the screen. And the question is that if I defend the camera and ear hypothesis, so this is the hypothesis that your ear right now is causing the pixels to have their concurrent configuration. Okay, that's why they're looking this way. It's just because of your ear. It's not because they're reflecting a picture of us at all. Your ear is just causing the pixels. And if I defend this hypothesis, I say, well, the ear has just the power required to produce these pixels. This will explain the data. It will explain the data. But the problem is that it builds the data into the hypothesis, and that's what lowers the prior probability of the hypothesis. It makes it less likely. So that was my thought. My thought was that if you say the foundation just has the power to produce this specific world, you're putting this specific world, the information about it, your description of it, into the hypothesis, and that's increasing its complexity. Now, maybe it doesn't make it like the ear hypothesis. Maybe it doesn't make it that bad, but it doesn't make it as simple as the supreme power hypothesis.
I think this is where your point earlier about it's not that limits are what causes complexity. It's that the description of the theory is what makes it complex. And so if you just add all of that stuff into the theory, the description of the theory, then that's what's making it so complex, is that you're saying that this hypothesis has exactly this amount of power. If you build that into the theory, then it's going to have to be more complex.
Yes. Yeah. And it's not just the description, like with the words we happen to use, because you might wonder, well, couldn't you describe it with more words or less words? I mean, like, for example, unmarried male, bachelor. means the same thing, but one is a longer description. So does that mean that unmarried male is less likely than bachelor, right? So it's not about the complexity of the words, it's about the complexity of the concepts in the theory. And maybe a way of
I like that distinction.
Yes, a way of drawing this out is to say theories have epistemic parts, okay? These are parts that are sort of I want to say epistemically independent parts. These are parts that like could be true, and they're not all necessarily true together. And the more parts you have, the less likely that they're all true together. And so we can come up with our theory, put it in its simplest form, and then see how many epistemic parts it has. And if it has a lot of epistemic parts, then it's going to be less likely. So that's the idea. Does that make it worse to use this new technical term?
No, I like it a lot. I think it helps to, because I was thinking about that myself. I was wondering, like, because you could explain it and use different terms. I mean, you could even just use like one letter and then say that with that one letter you mean all this other stuff.
Yes. And by the way, I mean, this isn't just like my idea, right? I mean, like I'm representing philosophers. I mean, they talk about this, right? So, yeah, I mean, this is a common understanding of how we get to theories that have a better prior probability and how we even measure simplicity.
All right. Before we move to questions, do you have anything else that you wanted to say about the discussion, about the points, the dialectic that went on?
Yeah. So I guess the only other thing is I have this Francis Bacon quote that I think is kind of interesting. I think it kind of summarizes the dialectic if we modify the quote in one way. So the quote goes like this. So Francis Bacon, a philosopher, he says, "A little philosophy, a man inclines a man's mind to atheism, but depth in philosophy brings men's minds about to religion." Now that word religion is kind of a scary word and people may not like that word. So let me replace that word with recognizes evidence for a rational foundation. So then I think that quote it's not only true, it's been empirically verified that the philosophers who really go deep, the atheist philosophers do recognize that there is evidence for a rational foundation. And I think that's pretty interesting. I think that's true. That's been shown.
Maybe we'll have to do a follow-up interview on like that, all the different like the data that theism or well, I can't put my words together right now. If we could do an episode, like, because you mentioned fine tuning and you mentioned some other stuff, and we didn't even get to complex.
Through all the predictive success. I mean, there's so many elements, and we sort of got caught in the theory to understand. This is why it gets all abstract, and then people have this feeling like, oh, it's so abstract. If you have to find God in this abstract way, that's just too hard, right? But that's because we're trying to go deep. We're trying to get clear about the theory, and that we kind of have to do that work because this is required to even understand the evidence we're looking at. But sometimes we have to maybe look at a bunch of different data points and move away from the abstract theorizing. Maybe that would help.
All right, so I have 3 questions, and I'm thankful to Sawyer Hudson. He's been moderating tonight. I'm sure you guys have seen him in the live chat. So he's been sifting through all the questions, and he just sent me them. So here is one of them from J.R. Aman. It says, in summary, what exactly is Josh's view as to what constitutes a rational justified belief? And how would this be different / better than Tom's epistemological view?
Okay, so I'm not going to compare in terms of better, but I will make a distinction. So my view roughly...
Yeah, well, can you talk about like
Yes.
why you think that kind of language is used? Like, because I know that's something you picked up on.
The better than language?
Yeah, why are we trying to talk about like better than?
I don't know, because we're competing. It's sort of the tension and
Yeah, we talked about that earlier.
Yes.
It's a competition. Yeah, it's like a competition when it doesn't have to be.
Doesn't have to be.
This is not. Yeah, I'm not trying to we're not trying to bash you.
Like, I have to say, I think Tom has a very valuable system, and I think he has a criterion for evidence that can do some good work. And I just need to say that. But so roughly, my view is that beliefs are justified by their senses, by our senses. When I was a student at Notre Dame, I took a class with Alvin Plantinga, and he's known for his work in epistemology, and he has a view that beliefs are justified by being produced by a properly functioning system. And so I ended up writing a paper for him where I argued that his system, Plantinga's system, is consistent with another system, which is that beliefs come from ultimately from what you're aware of through your senses. And so I think you've got many different senses, and that rational justification comes through those senses. Now, the way my system differs from Tom's is that I think my system can account for more of the beliefs that we take ourselves to be personally, individually justified in having. Again, making the distinction between having a justified belief and a true belief, because we can be perfectly justified based on our own experiences, our own senses, and not be correct in our thinking. That's why we need each other.
Yeah,
So
I think people are just like, they don't want to accept that someone could have a justified false belief. I think that might be part of what's going on.
I think that's part of the problem, because if your belief is false, I need to show you what's wrong with your belief, because it is false. And probably what's wrong with your belief is that it's not based on evidence, right?
Yeah, and part of I think the issue is that we're playing these different language games. So like someone is talking about justification, and if you don't know how that word is like actually analyzed and looked at in philosophy, you don't want to allow someone else to be justified in their belief. Whereas when you actually look at this term and you like analyze the way that it works or the way that philosophers look at it, then you can see that it's actually pretty easy to get justification, at least that property, that epistemic property.
Yes, I think justification is an easier bar than truth. And if you make justification your goal, that'll be easier to get that. And I have to just say, Cameron, the more that I talk with different philosophers and people who disagree with me about things, the more that it looks like the problem is not justification. The problem might have to do more with like how we search. Like, are we really looking at all the data? But people tend to be justified based on their own sort of awareness, what they've considered.
Here's something to think about. I think this will help make the point too. Is think about before we had evidence that the Earth was round. Were people like irrational, or were they unjustified in thinking that the Earth was flat? I don't see how anyone could answer yes. I mean, you might want to, but that seems, I don't know, that seems a little harsh.
You might say that's a silly belief, right? But then, I mean, in those days, it wasn't silly on their evidence, right?
Yeah, that's what seemed to them to be the case.
You can have two people, and given their different sets of evidence, person A can think that person's belief is silly on person A's evidence, right? But it doesn't follow that person A should think that person beliefs B is silly on person B's evidence. I think that's a mistake we make. We say, well, your belief is silly on my evidence, so it's silly on your evidence. And that's a problem.
I think that's a good point too. Okay, so let's move on to another question. Matthew Robinson. Oh, and by the way, everyone is apparently, Sawyer just told me that everyone is really thankful that you came on and did this follow-up interview. So just wanted to get that in there.
I'm thankful.
So this one is from Matthew Robinson. He says, David Hume used prior probability to demonstrate that miracles / the supernatural should never be an acceptable hypothesis.
Mm-hmm.
How would this comport with your belief that the prior probability of these types of things, i.e. that God exists or that Jesus rose from the dead, is actually acceptable?
So it's interesting. There's this book called Hume's Abject Failure, and it's about probability theory. And it's not, I mean, the title sort of sounds negative, right? But what's negative is really just a particular theory that was developed in the time of Hume that came before the development of probability theory. So now we have this deeper understanding of Bayesian probability. And so we're able to sort things out more clearly. And I mean, one thing I want to say about Hume is that I think he's right if he says that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence in the following respect. If you have a proposition that has a low prior probability, like, for example, I saw somebody give birth to a cat, my neighbor, right? That has a low prior probability. So it's going to take way more evidence to overcome that low prior probability.
See, I don't know. I think that if you just had like some video of it and you could just give them that, does that seem extraordinary though?
Well, maybe that would be extraordinary evidence, is the video, right? But even the video, you might wonder.
That's why I don't like that language. I don't like the language of extraordinary, right? Let's just use the language of like regular probability. So if you
Well,
have a
like
low prior probability, yeah.
yeah, like if you read a book, there's a low probability that book that you would read those specific sentences in that book, right? But then you can overcome that low prior probability just by reading the book. But I think one more point about this with respect to miracles. Miracles are hard to define, but I think it helps to zoom out and think about the big picture of reality, and it's going to depend on your own view. So each person is going to have a different prior probability depending on sort of what they've considered. But if you already have independent reason to think that there is a supreme foundation, a rational foundation, and that this foundation is good and desires to have good things happen, then you might think, and Richard Swinburne talks about this, you might think that the prior probability, prior now to the evidence with respect to a miracle claim, the prior probability that this being would do something special in history, like display love in a grand way, or even enter into the human scene to display forgiveness and to bring treasures of insight. You might think the prior probability of that actually isn't low if you already think God exists. And again, I'm talking about the probability prior to the particular evidence. So there's 2 points here. One is that low priors can be overcome with evidence. But then the second is that each person has to sort of check what the prior probability is given their own set of data. And it might be that on theism, the prior probability of certain miracles isn't as low. It's not like a guy giving birth to kittens, for example.
Yeah, if you think that God exists, then that's going to raise the prior probability a little bit of some kind of miracle. You know, there's going to be a lot of other factors in play there. And actually, if you guys want to check it out, I did a podcast, 2-parter podcast with Dr. Callum Miller. That's on our podcast too. And we actually looked at this question specifically, like what is the prior probability of the resurrection? So if you want to check that out, feel free to listen. He's a brilliant guy. So let's move on to some questions from Cam Spears. I hope I'm pronouncing that your last name correctly, Cam. I also like that your name is Cam. But I've never been able to tell if it's like Spires or Spears. Anyways, let's get to this first question. He has a bunch of questions, so we'll try to go through as many as we can. And they're all kind of technical. He's well-versed in probability theory, and it looks like in formal logic and stuff. So this is one of his questions. Is a supreme being able to be analyzed using any form of formal algorithmic complexity? If not, what formal measure of complexity is used to justify the claim that the supreme being is simple?
Okay, so if it'd be fun to just talk with Cam about this, because first thing I want to ask is, what do you really mean by formal measure? I mean, is this maybe a measure that's recognized by authorities? And what does that really mean? I mean, the way that I think about it is that I'm sort of using a common measure that scientists would use, where we can break apart a hypothesis into its conceptually simplest components. And then we can ask, how many components does it have? And then the hypothesis with the fewest components is going to have the highest prior probability. That's really all that I'm thinking about here. So in that sense, I mean, sure, I mean, this is sort of a standard way of thinking about it. It's not non-standard.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to answer the question because, I don't have Cam right here to to talk with, right? But I mean, the concept of a supreme being is the concept of a something with the highest degree of value. Okay, so that would be a hypothesis, or you could go with the rational foundation hypothesis, that the foundation has reason built into it. And it's simple in the sense that it doesn't have many different conceptual components. That's the idea.
Okay, so then here's another question from him, same guy. Can we find a better method for determining entailments from the supreme being hypothesis than your examples or thought experiments?
So it's interesting because in logic, I've been thinking a lot about logic and like what it is, and actually was thinking that logic is almost like the internet in the sense that when human beings first discovered the internet, we associated it with its initial forms like search and like Hotmail, right? That's what the internet is, right? And then we discovered, oh, it can do more and it can do more. We don't really know the limits of the internet. And logic is sort of similar in that when we first discovered sort of the principles of reason and like encoded them, we had sort of a few, and then we call them formal principles, formal logic. And then we discover more, and then there's sort of this contest between people who think that all necessary truths are deducible from the sort of original ones that we found. And so these are like called analytic truths, versus those who think, oh no, there are some necessary truths that we can sort of see by reason that aren't deducible from the original ones we found. And I mean, and the more that philosophers and logicians have looked into this, it looks like we just see that there's more and more principles and there's really no limit. And so the way that I think about it is that logic just is the inquiry through the light of reason, and reason doesn't really reveal its own limits. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because I think people limit themselves when they sort of reduce all logic to some already discovered formal principles. And they're only formal or canonical because they were the first ones found. But I mean, we can expand our logic books by including principles of axiology. I mean, one of the things I discovered in graduate school was all these systems of logic that I didn't even know existed, like the logic of parts and wholes, right? I mean, there's this thing called mereology, which looks at sort of axioms of parts and wholes and teases out implications there. There is this system called axiology, the theory of value, and then there's inferences you can make from there in formal ways. Or when I say formal, I mean just in ways that are recognized and well understood. And then, you know, there's systems of logic of time even. There's tensed logic, right? People don't realize it. There's modal logic, logic of possibility and necessity. And so, yeah, I mean, I would say that we can actually apply reason to anything, and we can tease out implications just by using your mind and seeing what you can see. And you can't do that without actually trying to see what you can see. And so I think, yeah, you can look at value and you can tease out from supreme value specific attributes, but you have to do the work to actually do it. I mean, you have to see it. You have to test to see if you can see it.
So I think this is a really similar question. That's why I'm kind of jumping in here. Is the this is again from Cam, is the hypothesis of a supreme being expressible in a language such that we can apply a logic and determine entailments? I guess that's kind of the same question.
Yes, I just want to say yes to that. And also, these are really great questions. Because I mean, they do highlight the value of getting things systematized. I actually have daydreamed of making a logic book that systematizes this very thing. I mean, this is one of the things I've thought about, just making the book just sort of the foundations of axiology and just writing explicitly what the axioms are and deducing the theorems. I think this can be done. Yes.
Okay. And here's another one from him. In your use of value, are you reifying a contingent product of the human mind to derive entailments? Does your hypothesis imply all conscious beings will have consistent values?
Well, to the first, I'm not trying to, right? Like,
yeah.
I'm trying to just see what follows from value in the same way that a mathematician would try to see what follows from the axioms of numbers or the axioms of shapes. You know, just, I mean, where do these axioms come from ultimately? And one of the things I talk about in my classes is sort of the foundations of knowledge. Well, ultimately, you come down to the axioms where you just see, right? And then you can see deductions from there. So remind me of the second question.
Does your hypothesis imply all conscious beings will have consistent values?
I don't think it would imply that, right? Because
I guess it depends on how conscious someone is, right? Because some people think that animals are conscious in some sense.
Yeah, so maybe this is part of the sort of relativism worry that people can sort of deduce different things, and especially when we're talking about value, because value is often associated with subjectivity and relativity. What I want to say is that there are.
I hope you guys are still with me. It looks like he cutting out, or I hope it's not me. I hope it's him, because I actually don't know. I don't have anybody to talk to right now. Let me see if it's still up here in the live chat. Okay, yeah, it looks like it's still going. Okay, so I guess I'll just wait for him to come back. That's unfortunate. Well, let me just check out the comments here. I don't know where you guys are at here. Cam says he was banned. Okay, good. Tom is saying that the stream is still live. So I'm still waiting. There he is. It says
Did I disappear?
Yeah, you did.
So just to finish this thought, okay? So we're talking about value, and I appreciate the worry that value judgments are relative, and I think that's kind of the heart of the worry. Different conscious minds will make different value judgments. And what I want to suggest is that if moral realism is true, then there are correct value judgments. And to illustrate this, if I'm praising my wife and I'm saying, Rachel, you're so valuable, and here's why I think you're so valuable. You are ugly, you're evil, you're manipulative, and I hate you. What I've said is incorrect. Those are not good deductions from the starting premise that she has value. And I think that we can see that. And if somebody says something different, then they've actually made a mistake. Just like if somebody says 2 + 2 = 5, they've made a mistake. So I do think that different minds could see different things. But if what they're seeing is the actual moral landscape, the axiological landscape, the landscape of value, then they might be seeing different crevices within the same landscape. And this could explain why it looks like they're disagreeing, but really they're not. They're seeing different crevices within the same landscape. But it could also be just that one of them is mistaken, right? They've actually just not sort of seen clearly. And that's possible.
So here's one. It looks like this is going to be the last question. We do kind of need to end it since we've gone so long. So this one is from Z Yonder. He says, doesn't complexity apply only to that which is created rather than that which is eternal?
I don't see why just a priori that would have to be true. I can imagine an eternal thing that's complicated. So imagine turtles, infinitely many turtles, and they're just eternal. These are special turtles. Now, maybe you could argue that the ultimate explanation of things isn't going to be complicated in that way. And I think there's good reason to argue in that direction. But I would have to think more about how to tease out simplicity just from eternality. That would have to, I mean, it's not to say that the deduction can't be made, but I'm not seeing how to make that deduction. So.
Okay. All right. I think that's going to be it for tonight, guys. So thanks for joining us on the stream here. But Josh, did you have any last things that you wanted to say to the audience?
Well, just thank you. Thank you for engaging, and thank you, Cameron, for having me on. This is very interesting, very valuable and productive. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Yeah, I always love talking with you. I wish we could
likewise
pretty much just talk all day, but all right. Well, thanks again, guys, for tuning in. This is our first live interview, and it's on a review of a discussion, but hopefully I'm going to start doing more of these interviews. We actually have one lined up either next week. The date on it is actually a little bit unclear right now. There might be a conflict, so we might have to move it back, but I'm going to be interviewing Dr. Jerry Walls, and we'll be talking about heaven and some objections, some atheist objections to heaven. So make sure to tune into that. Right now it's scheduled for Wednesday, but again, that might change. So just be on the lookout. I'll send you guys an update if it does change. But thanks for joining me today on this interview with Dr. Josh Rasmussen. Hopefully we can do something else, something in the future. Josh, we talked about, like, at the very end, we talked about dualism. I think that'd still be a really interesting discussion to have. So
yes, I have a whole bunch of quotes by atheists who say that the hard problem is really a problem and that nobody solved it. Just to illustrate, this is not a Sunday school invention, right? I mean, this is like an actual problem that people think about and deal with. And yeah, so maybe we could talk about that sometime.
Cool. All right. Well, I'll see you guys later. I'm actually going to go and make myself some food because I am starving. So, all right. See you guys later.